interesting things to reflect on there from what Keir Starmer has just said, going back to what he said about keeping an eye on the mental health aspect of this individual who's currently being questioned by counter-terrorism police to find out whether any Nottingham-style, Southport-style horrible omissions happened in the case of this individual. We do not know. We have to let that investigation continue. His answer to my question as to whether he in his own constituency, which he nearly lost that seat, he only won it by just over 500 votes when push came to shove on general election night. An anti-Israel, pro-Gaza candidate was pushing him very hard on that. So clearly in his Ilford constituency there was a great deal of support for that. He said yes, he does hear extremist statements, extremist beliefs, and he challenges them head on in his own constituency. He also talked about the hard left, not just Muslim communities having to address this, but the hard left of politics having questions to answer as well, which I very much believe that they do, as of course aspects of the far right as well. I mean, this is just this odd coming together of the hard left and the far right, isn't it? Very strange bedfellows indeed, but they somehow find a soft place to fall together when it comes to Israel. Interesting that, isn't it? When he said we have to challenge this as a community, I'm going to talk more about that throughout the afternoon, but here's what I would say to the government. If we had more time with West Streeting, I would have said it to him, but here's what I would say to the government about the kind of omissions and slack response, soft response where a hard response was needed that we have seen over 2 years is, I'm going to say it as fast as I can because it's a long list, sadly, and it's a very small part of the bigger picture, but I'm just going to read where I think there have been glaring omissions in response that has led us to, by the way, what I believe to be a national emergency. I called it yesterday at 1 o'clock a sectarian emergency. That would be my preferred description of it. I think we are now in a sectarian emergency. We've seen globalise the Intifada, left, right and centre on our streets. We've seen placards of bleeding babies in a bin alongside the Star of David, River to the Sea chants, Jewish artists being cancelled, one Jewish MP being banned from a school visit by an inclusion officer, no less, a petition in an NHS hospital against working with Jewish doctors or being trained by Jewish doctors, an NHS doctor suspended for anti-Semitic posts, countless non-deadly attacks have happened, synagogue killings in Manchester that we saw last year, the Slough attack that I spoke about just the other day with the victim of it, Moisha. It's just a tiny slice of what's been happening in this country. And I think there has, without a doubt, been too slack a response, both from individuals within our communities, just us, the people, and too slack a response from government for sure. And I think that has to change. Yesterday, as I left the studio at 4 o'clock, when I heard Sarah Sackman, the local Labour MP, and the chief of the Met, Sir Mark Rowley, being very, very loudly heckled and berated and barracked, it briefly reminded me of the moment Andy Burnham was barracked and berated and heckled and shouted down at Anfield over the Hillsborough Papers. It was a moment when ordinary people, yesterday I'm talking about now, it was a moment when ordinary people, probably mostly Jewish people in that instance, were saying, enough, you are the government, you are in Parliament, you are the head of policing, do better. And that's what that Anfield moment was, and that's what yesterday was. Now, the Anfield moment was a tipping point in that story. Yesterday should be a tipping point in this story. Fast forward to today, we have the Prime Minister himself in Golders Green being heckled, people shouting him down, Starmer the Jew harmer. I mean, God, imagine that being levelled at you. Starmer the Jew harmer. And that's why I read that list. And this isn't just directed at Keir Starmer, this is directed at an awful lot of people. That list, brief list, ugly list, stuff that's been tolerated for far too long, I think it needs to be a tipping point. I think it is a sectarian emergency in our country. These people who say this is not the country that we are, this is not who we are, what we are. Yes, it is. If enough of us are prepared to do what that man yesterday appears to have done, the suspect, if enough people are prepared to be filled with that hatred towards Jews, and I think we've got evidence that they are, then it is the country we have become. And if you don't want it to be that country, you as an individual have to work out what you can do as an individual to counter it. It's down to individuals and it's down to government. It's down to organisations who don't, banning Jewish artists because they don't like Israel. I mean, come on. By the way, going door to door, campaigning, canvassing people randomly out of the blue to ban Israeli projects. What if it's a Jewish person at the door? What if it's an Israeli supporting person at the door? How do you think they're going to feel about that? That is no way to behave on the streets of Britain. It's no way to campaign on the streets of Britain. So do you say it is a national emergency or not? Jonathan Hall, the chief independent terrorism advisor on the law around counter-terrorism, he says it is. Shabana Mahmood told Nick Ferrari this morning, she said, in her words, we're not there yet. I disagree. I think we are there yet. I would call it a sectarian emergency for sure. What about you? 0345 6060 973. One of the things, when she talks about stalling diplomatic norms, one of the things I think she's alluding to there is not allowing the kinds of protests that we've seen. Again, I'm hugely supportive of protests taking place, but I think some of the stuff I listed there is inherent in those protests, and we have not done enough about it. 0345 6060 973. You could barely say it without being shouted down. Today, I've noticed that some politicians, including Shabana Mahmood, we just heard there, are now, and West Streeting when I spoke to him earlier, are now much more readily talking about the anti-Semitism that's clearly been growing within the NHS. And it's important to say that, the NHS, like any large organisation, will inevitably be a reflection of the society that it's in. So I'm not landing, uniquely on the NHS. I think our universities are experiencing the same thing. Other smaller organisations and institutions are experiencing the same thing. But those organisations have leaders, and those leaders have to stamp out on racism wherever they find it. And if it's the kind of racism that encourages violence, a la some of the placards we've seen and the chants we've seen on some of those protests, then it behoves them to do something about it. If they know that one of their employees is chanting extremist rhetoric either by a placard or out of their mouth, they need to do something about it too, not just the police who happened to be near that person on the day. Henry's call from Jonathan Harounoff, Israel's international spokesperson to the United Nations General Assembly. Good afternoon to you. Again, nice to have you in the studio again.
Good afternoon.
You were actually by chance in Hendon yesterday having lunch when this happened. What was your response when you heard about this attack?
I was actually in Golders Green on Golders Green Road, having brunch at the top of Golders Green Road, where started to hear a lot of commotion.
Oh my God, you're from Hendon.
I'm from Hendon, but from Golders Green. And I was in Golders Green yesterday. I had been scheduled to actually have a talk with the Holocaust survivors at around 1 o'clock. And prior to that, during brunch, started to see a lot of helicopters, police officers, ambulances. And unfortunately, given the track record of Golders Green in the past few weeks, there was very visible concerns that something else had happened. There was the stabbing. And then, of course, we spent a couple of hours there and there was the press conference and there was very visible anger and concern about the plight of Jewish people there and their future. And I think the thing that really doesn't get talked about enough is the fact that Golders Green Road, the High Street, is lined with Union Jacks and lined with the flag of Great Britain, the United Kingdom. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because this is a very proud Jewish community, but it's also fiercely proud to be British. And unfortunately, the people that I've spoken to and family, they're feeling like those two things are under threat right now.
When we see what we've just seen in the last 10 minutes or so, the Prime Minister being heckled, as he was, and I'm sure we'll have audio of that soon, being called a Jew harmer, Starmer that Jew harmer, and a traitor. Do you agree with any of that?
I wouldn't necessarily use language like that, but I saw similar sentiments be repeated yesterday towards the Labour MP, and there were people calling for her resignation. And I think it stems from a deep, deep concern for people's future in this great country. And this is not an isolated incident. If it was an isolated incident, yes, it would have been tragic and horrific. But you're seeing a real clear, disturbing pattern emerge in a very small area, Golders Green, whether it's the 4 Hatzalah ambulances that were burnt to the ground, a Finchley Reform Synagogue arson attack, and now yesterday's stabbing. I mean, that's, I think, where this language is stemming from. The Iranian Memorial Wall. And this is all, you can see the Iranian Memorial Wall from where all of the police cordoned off the area yesterday. And that's, I think, where that language is stemming from. And that not enough, plenty is being done after the fact, but not enough is being done to mitigate and thwart these things from happening in the first place.
It's easy to understand why the Foreign Ministry of Israel and the Prime Minister's office in Israel might want to send a message to the Jews of Golders Green and say, solidarity, and then criticise those who they think are failing them. But given that one of the strong messages from British Jews, like you've just said, is we are proud British Jews. We are not responsible for, or necessarily even connected to, decisions taken by the Israeli government. Is it helpful for the Israeli government to send those messages and to intervene in that way, or do you think it is just an appropriate form of solidarity?
I think it's an appropriate form of solidarity, a message that there is an undeniable, innate connection between Jewish community here and the people in Israel, the state of Israel. People here have many family, friends, relatives. My mother is Israeli.
And not all British Jews feel that.
Absolutely. But I don't think there's anything wrong with the country pointing out the flaws and just repeating the concerns of British Jewish people.
If Jewish people leave, they are, I guess, more likely to go to Israel.
Well, the reality is, in
these circumstances, I mean,
if British Jewish people leave, they're not necessarily leaving because they are being asked to by someone else. They're leaving because they're being forced to leave this country that they love and make aliyah to Israel or to move somewhere else where they're safe. Unfortunately, there's been this trend of globalizing the intifada, which means that the threat is indeed global. So nowhere is safe. Sydney, Canada, even Israel, I mean, obviously is under attack, but it's about what measures are being taken to protect Jewish life and
just be careful with the mic.
Sorry.
I sometimes headbutt it, I wouldn't worry about it. Can I ask you,
yes,
the question of a national emergency, which is how Jonathan Hall has described it. I called it yesterday a sectarian emergency, and there are other non-Jewish examples of that as well, I think. The Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood demurring and saying, not yet, now isn't the time to call this a national emergency. What's your position on that?
When is the time to call it a national? It should have been called a national emergency at Heaton Park massacre, Yom Kippur. Now it's beyond a national emergency. It's undoubtedly an emergency, and it's why I think the response has been so forceful. It's why the police presence anywhere. I've been here for a couple of days speaking at Jewish schools and different community centres, and there's staggering, really disturbing levels of security that are very necessary, and I'm grateful for it. But of course it's a national security. It shouldn't be a normal existence for Jewish people to have to live behind high walls and with all of this intense security.
And it's not new. The security itself isn't new, is it? The intensity of it is new. The increase in it is new. But it's happened for many, many years.
For sure.
You said a moment ago you wouldn't use the language that the hecklers used against Keir Starmer. Try to say for me where you think he and the government have been too slow, too lax, unresponsive.
When we're talking about, if we just talk about the Middle East in Iran and the conflict there, what you've seen time and time again is a posture of appeasement, a weak language, continuous claims that the United Kingdom doesn't want to get embroiled in this conflict between Israel, the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. But I think what you've seen and been made abundantly clear here is that the Islamic Republic has brought this war to the shores of Europe and to the shores of Britain. And I think that's where you've seen a tremendous amount of weakness, regardless of who was behind yesterday's attack. And I believe there has been this pop-up spin-off Iranian-linked terrorist group that's claimed proudly responsibility. I think that's
you say that predates the war, the current war in Iran, on Iran?
Well, what does?
The kind of interventions by the Iranian regime in Britain.
Well, yes, if you look at, and it hasn't even been just targets of Jewish communities. You see, the UK intelligence services last year said that there were more than 20 serious terrorist attacks that were foiled with links to the Islamic Republic in just a year alone. You've seen Iran International, which is one of the biggest anti-government news broadcasters in the world, Persian language and English language, which was headquartered here in the United Kingdom, be targeted on British soil. You've seen Iran International, Persian, Iranian dissident journalists who aren't Jewish be stabbed here. This is something that transcends Jewish life and is a real national threat, and it's another reason why this is a national emergency.
You used the word appeasement there about some of the government failings that I asked you to outline, in your view, the failings. So Keir Starmer is, and it may not be language you would use directly to him, but he's an appeaser. Who's he appeasing? How has that appeasement been evident in your view?
Especially in the Middle East, if you approach diplomacy or approach certain topics with language that is construed as weak, and you're not projecting a strength, and instead you're expecting that an adversary like the Islamic Republic is just going to bow to whatever you're saying. I think that is weak language, and that's something that the Islamic Republic, whose negotiators and diplomats are very proficient and adept at what they do, can sense a mile away. That's why I think their behaviour towards the United Kingdom and towards the United States are very different.
They've been given too much room. Is that what you're saying?
I think the Islamic Republic has pulled the wool over the United Kingdom's and some of other European governments' eyes, and what's happening.
Would you include recognising the state of Palestine as appeasement?
That's a totally separate topic, and at the time when those declarations were made at the United Nations, I was there. It was a week where all of these very premature declarations were made before a ceasefire had even been struck, while there were still hostages lingering, while other very critical matters weren't being resolved. So it seemed like a very performative gesture that wasn't actually helping the Gazans, wasn't helping anyone. It was just an opportunity for these leaders to use the podium of the UN to not really advance anything, just to get headlines.
It seems to me that if we are going to make progress, I'm just thinking about the UK here now, if we're going to make progress on the fight against anti-Semitism, and more broadly on sectarianism, but just to focus in my conversation with you on anti-Semitism, the hecklers are shouting, you're a traitor, you're a traitor. You've already made it clear you wouldn't use that kind of language. Let me ask you a question, because of course traitor is to your country typically, isn't it? But has Keir Starmer betrayed British Jews?
The framing of this question, and I've seen it repeated quite often, is a bit uncomfortable, because it seems like the onus, or there's some blame or questions being asked of the Jewish community. I think the focus really should be on letting the British government, their leaders, speak and say what they're going to do. Some of the members of the crowd, and
I'm just asking you whether you think he's betrayed them, because clearly the people shouting at him, shouting at the MP, shouting at the head of the Met Police, feel very let down, very betrayed, abandoned almost. I mean, that's a word I've seen overnight by people in Golders Green. So they feel abandoned. And again, that isn't just focused at the government, that's focused at ordinary Brits who aren't standing up for Jews.
What I've seen and heard is that there are very clear feelings of isolation, abandonment, and the only time where they do see a massive presence is after the fact, after tragedy strikes. And what I'm hearing time and time again is that they don't want it to reach that point where the only time you have this huge gathering of support, mobilisation, help is after a tragedy. It has to be before.
You mentioned you went to, just a final thought that's occurred to me before I must let you go. You mentioned that you've gone to schools to speak at schools. Do you ever go to non-Jewish schools to speak? And this isn't an accusation against you or a challenge to you. I'm just wondering how readily that could happen in this country at the moment. Would it, do you think?
I have been all over the world to speak about my personal experience, to speak about Iran, which is a topic I've written about extensively and written a book about. And whenever there is an invitation, Jewish or not Jewish, I would always gladly consider it. I haven't spoken at high schools yet that aren't Jewish, but I've spoken at universities to non-Jewish groups, and I would welcome the opportunity. It's something that I love doing.
British schools?
Absolutely. It's important to have these conversations, and you learn both ways. You learn how people who you don't always encounter and come across feel and think, and they also get to be exposed to a perspective that they might not be familiar with.
Well, if that happens, do let us know, because it would be lovely to accompany you and to see how that conversation goes, because we're going to talk more about education after 2, and it's got to be a big part of the answer here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan Harounoff, Israel's international spokesperson to the United Nations.